Welcome back to Goldmark TV, to another broadcast. We've got a couple of really exciting things to show you today. First, a set of 80 Guinomi by Phil Rogers as part of his new exhibition here at the Goldmark Gallery. We're really excited to show you some of those pots. And then we're going to have a look at the beautiful print works of Marc Chagall. I hope you enjoy. I thought today, given that we've got our upcoming Phil Rogers exhibition that we're going to be having a wonderful walkthrough, a preview of this weekend, that I'd introduce you to some of his work, and what better way than one of these sets of 80 Guinomi. This is now, I think, our 17th set of Guinomi that Phil Rogers has made specially for us for these exhibition cases. That's 1,300, more than 1,300 Guinomi over the last 5 or 6 years. The idea for these lovely pots started back in 2014. Phil had made 80 beautiful little Guinomi for us for an exhibition, and rather than dot them around the exhibition, we decided we would show them together in a specially built case like this. We assembled one, we put the pots up, we took a lovely photograph, and within a couple of minutes we'd already had a call from Germany from someone saying they'd like to buy the whole lot. So it's become a sort of running tradition for Phil and for us. It's really a beautiful way of introducing you to Phil's work, because everything that Phil does, all of the decorative treatment, all of the glazes, all of the different firings, all represented here in these 80 pots. What you're looking at over here represents something like 9 or 12 months of labour for Phil. The pots that are shown have to be fired over 3 different firings in 3 different kilns. There's an oil kiln, a salt kiln for the salt glazed pots, and a wood-fired kiln. And unlike many ceramic installations, which are becoming a bit of a fashionable thing of seeing many different vessels collected together, you'll see from looking at these pots, every single one of them is individual, every single one of them is unique. Every one of them, Phil has taken the time to, the forethought and the care to work out which glaze will marry to which shape, which decoration will then be applied with that glaze. It's a really time-consuming project for him to put one of these together, but the results are just fantastic, as you can see here next to me. There's a number of different shapes and forms and glazes that you can see over here, and even there are some things that I've not seen for a while, some shapes that I've not seen in previous sets. This is our 17th set. Even now there are still new things happening with these pots. It's lovely to see among these beautiful dark temokus and these orange sort of shigaraki type clays, these beautiful wood-fired pots, some of the different nuka glazes and ash glazes. It's lovely to see a couple of porcelain editions as well, sort of cool, calm foil to those sort of lovely warm textures and warm surfaces. Guinomi were originally used in Japan and Korea for drinking sake in Japan and soju in Korea. They're both rice wines, but really we think you could enjoy anything from a dram of whiskey or an espresso shot or something. But they're a beautiful object to live with and play with and to rearrange. There's something really quite satisfying about seeing the different tensions between different pots and different glazes, and seeing that, having a sort of living thing on the wall that can be sort of reorganized at will. You'll see there's so many different types of glazes and decoration going on here. Something like one of these beautiful pots which has got a couple of ash glazes on it, with this incision design, Phil is always considering how the decorative treatment that he gives his pots is going to help his glazes get the most out of those glazes. Ash glazes, which are lovely and runny, really benefit from areas where they can pool on or break away from, so that you can get that beautiful spectrum that an ash glaze gives you, from the lightest sort of jewel-like greens to these beautiful dark patches that you get pooling at the bottom of these facets and of these incised marks. So you'll see different decorations like that, paddling, incising, combing through the pot surface, sgraffito, on a number of these different pots. What's also lovely about these pots is, considering how big Phil is, how big his hands are, he's able to get real sort of dexterity and gracefulness in these little pots. There's something really to be said for small pots and the way that they capture what a potter is about in sort of in a very small and concise way. And I think the different characters that you get throughout these Guinomi really represent the ways that Phil has been trying to push his own boundaries, to challenge himself, to find new ideas, new forms, new textures, new surfaces, new glazes even, within the tradition that he's rooted in and which he's been expanding over the years. Let's have a little clip of Phil now throwing some of these Guinomi and talking about the working practices that go behind these pots.
I'm quite happy working in it's not so much a tradition, I think it's more of a genre. And my influences are many. I mean, sometimes people look at my work and they kind of mistakenly see just a very small influence, but in fact the influences are many. I've been influenced by Korean pottery always, since starting. I ended up married to a Korean lady, but I was interested in Korean pottery right from the very beginning. Certain Japanese pottery, not all Japanese pottery by any means, but certain Japanese pottery. Late medieval German salt glaze, 17th and 18th century English slipware, American settler pots, pots that were made all up the east coast of America from North Carolina right up into New York. Mostly pots made by German and Dutch immigrant. So there was a huge connection between what they were making, because they'd made it first of all in Europe. All of those influences fed their way into what I was trying to do. The fun part for me is the throwing. What keeps me interested in making pots is working on the forms and making the forms work. So if I get an idea for something, the challenge to make that work, that's what keeps me interested. And I very much enjoy that aspect of it. I don't design on paper very much. I do draw and I do sketch shapes and ideas, but generally throwing for me is like drawing in the air. You're creating a line in the air, and that line is alterable. You can change it. That's the nice thing about clay, because it's soft and you can change it immediately. I could never become a metal worker or a woodworker, because you have to really put some effort into changing anything, and it's not immediate. I can poke my thumb into the side of a pot, that's changed it. Split second, you know. So that's the nice thing about clay, that it's immediate. The drawback in pottery is that there is so much that can go wrong. Every stage there's something that can go wrong. And we as potters, when you're working to make a living from pottery in the way that I do, and people like in this country like Mike Dodd and Richard Batterham and Jim Malone, and people who work in the kind of genre that I work in, we have to know an awful lot. You know, we don't just make the pots. We have to know how to make glazes. We have to have an understanding of basic geology. We have to know about fire and draft and pyromania and all of these things that go towards making up a potter. And it is a lot of work, and it's a lot of knowledge that you have to kind of to gather together. I try to use local materials if I can. I find that I'm somewhat limited here because most of the rocks that surround me, and it's rock that we use to make glaze, that's the basis of glaze. Most of those rocks are iron bearing, and so it's kind of limiting. There's very, very little clay around here because we're all on the rock. So, but I do try to use as much, and all of my glazes, well, not all, but pretty nearly all of my glazes contain wood ash. And so the wood ash comes from the fire in the house. I use a clay which I dig from the woods on the other side of town, and I use that as a slip. It's not a clay that you can throw with. It's a terracotta, not very plastic clay, so you can't throw with it, but I use it as a slip. So this is one of the few local materials that I can use. It's a very, very coarse earthenware clay. It fires to a terracotta flower pot colour, even though it doesn't look like that now, but it's got quite a lot of iron in it. And I use it as a slip, particularly for when I do the finger wiping to get that nice sort of red colour. It just acts as a thin surface on the clay to highlight that redness. I have tried throwing with it, but it's very, very coarse, and it's almost like throwing with sand, very fine sand. It's not very plastic, although that did roll into a sausage, which kind of proves that at least it's clay. I'm not a big decorator. I mean, I'm not a decorator in the sense that, you know, I use lots of brushwork or many different pigments and different sort of techniques, complicated techniques of wax resist and layer on layer. And I'm not very good at that, and I don't do it. On the other hand, I find it very difficult to let a pot go through without some form of decoration. So most of my decorations are in the clay. Either in the clay or through a coating of slip. So I might draw through a white slip to reveal the body underneath. I might coat a pot in the local clay slip, which is a sort of reddish colour, and then glaze it and then wipe that glaze away to reveal the slip underneath. Something that I call finger wiping. Sometimes I'll use stamps and impress the pot with stamps, or use a wooden tool with a comb on it to draw. And most of the decorations are there to give the ash glazes, which are quite fluid, something to work on, something to pool in and to change colour, to change texture. And any decoration that I do in the clay, particularly if it's through a white slip, those glazes will highlight it. So you get this effect where you have a glaze that's pooled in a drawing, changed colour, become darker, become shinier, and that highlights that little drawing in front of a sort of lighter, mistier background.
I'm just looking at this Paris Opera House poster by Marc Chagall. In 1963, Chagall was commissioned to paint the Opera House ceiling. He was 77 years old, and it took him a whole year to complete. It's got everything that you might expect from a Chagall painting. It's got animals, spirits and figures flying through the air, suspended over the cityscape, flowers, beautiful jewel-like colour. Chagall is probably best known as a Jewish artist, an artist who brought the Jewish faith and its stories to life for people. But it's really as a storyteller that he's made his mark. He was a desperately emotional soul, hugely sentimental, and stories inspired everything that he did, whether it's from the Bible, from the folklore of his native Russia, or from the epic poetry of old. Looking at a Chagall image is like seeing a story spilling out from the page in front of you. He was to become one of the greatest printmakers of the 20th century, and many of the stories surrounding his print series are as original as the stories that he sought to reproduce. Today we're going to have a look at some of the seminal print works that he made and for which he's best remembered. Chagall was born in Vitebsk in 1887. It's modern-day Belarus, which was then part of the Russian Empire. He was born to a Hasidic family. He was the eldest of 9 children at a time when Jewish identity was very precarious. The pogroms raged through the 19th century, and Chagall was forced to hide much of his Jewishness. Jews were not allowed to attend the usual schools, the usual universities, and when, in 1906, Chagall left for St. Petersburg to further his studies in art, you had to have a permit as a Jew to enter the city. In 1910, he came to Paris in a move to further his art, and a move that would galvanise one of the most extraordinary developments in a career in art in the 20th century. These are prints from Gogol's Dead Souls. It was the first major etching series that Chagall produced in 1923. It was commissioned by Ambroise Vollard, who was one of the preeminent gallerists and dealers of the early 20th century, and a defender of the avant-garde in Paris. In fact, unbeknownst to Vollard, Chagall had met him 12 years earlier. When he first came to Paris in 1910, Chagall had launched himself into the artistic communes of the city. He lived in Montparnasse and befriended the artists and poets there. He brought to their strange avant-garde world a very different kind of art, full of colour, wit, humour and rustic warmth. He'd sought out the paintings of Cézanne in Paris, and he'd went to visit Vollard's gallery on the Rue Lafitte, and he peered in through the shadowy windows to catch a glimpse of the paintings there, and he could see Vollard in the room, but he daren't enter. By 1922, Chagall was living in Berlin. He'd been working there for a number of months when word came from his friend and poet Blaise Cendrars that Vollard knew of his work and wanted to meet him. He travelled back to Paris, and they met in September of 1923. Vollard had thought that Chagall had died in the First World War. In fact, he'd spent those years in Moscow, living in sort of penniless poverty, stretching out a living as a teacher and working for the theatre, though the conservative critics there in Moscow had reviled his work. Vollard asked him what work he would like to take on as his first livre d'artiste under Vollard's as a publisher, and Chagall suggested Gogol's Dead Souls, the Russian writer's great unfinished masterpiece. Gogol's work offered plenty of material to work with. It took Chagall back to his memories of childhood life in Russia, the folkloric traditions, the pattern of everyday urban and rural life that he'd remembered there as a child. The designs that Chagall made had so delighted Vollard that he quickly commissioned 2 more series, the Fables of La Fontaine and the Bible series. These are Chagall's etchings of the Fables of La Fontaine, and it's a particularly special suite that we have because it includes beautiful hand colouring applied by Chagall himself after the gouache designs that he made for these etchings. Traditionalists in the French press and Parliament were in uproar when they heard that Vollard had Chagall in line to tackle this very classic piece of classic French literature. In fact, the debate raged on and ended up at the Chamber of Deputies. And when Vollard was asked why Chagall for this series, he replied, "Simply because it seems to me that Chagall has an aesthetic akin to La Fontaine's, at once sound and delicate, realistic and fantastic." Chagall explored the full emotional range of these cautionary tales, from their cruelty, their melancholy and irony, right the way through to their joy and tenderness. Chagall revelled in their allegory. He made the human figures wild, like beasts, and the beasts gentle, timid, brave and raucous, like people. Then came the Bible series, arguably the most important and most personal of all of Chagall's works in print. He began work on the plates in 1930, just after he'd finished the last etchings of the La Fontaine suite. This was a time of precipitousness in his life. He and his wife Bella had bought a new house on the Rue de Sycamore. It was large, overgrown and in need of restoration. They had the Wall Street crash just behind them, and they were almost entirely reliant on Vollard for their money. Chagall produced some 40 etchings before, in 1934, Vollard suspended the commission, weathering his own costs from the Depression. Then, in 1939, Vollard died in a car crash, leaving the Chagalls in turmoil. It was Peretz-Arad, the publisher, who rescued Vollard's ventures. Both the Bible series, the La Fontaine fables and Gogol's Dead Souls were all published under his name, and it's thanks to him that we have some of them to see today. Here, the Jewishness that Chagall had repressed in his art, had sublimated in it, was allowed to burst forth with a new life, a new sense of expression. Judaism does not have an easy history with iconographic art, but in the Bible, Chagall found a subject with great resonance. It was not just a sacred document, but a history of lived experience. Its tales of exile and wandering were not just parables, they were the actual experience of Jewish people in the diaspora across Europe. And it became a sort of a private conduit of worship through which these scattered people could be unified. It brought up not just memories of Pesach as a child with his father, but new visions prompted by the series. He travelled to Palestine in 1930, as it was then, and drew in the Holy Land under the streaming light of that place. It's the light that floods and fills these etchings, that scatters across these sort of dark, hatched areas. Unlike the La Fontaine etchings with their scratchy dry point, or the areas of aquatint in the Gogol's Dead Souls, this was pure etching. It was pure light and dark, chiaroscuro. And all the intense drama of the epic stories of the Torah are expressed in these etchings. Bible stayed with Chagall throughout his life. It became the rock in his art. His Jewish faith, his exploration of Judaism, its traditions, its symbols, they invigorated his art throughout his career. In 1960, the Bible led to another commission to produce stained glass windows for the synagogue at the Hadassah Medical Center in Jerusalem. Chagall produced 12 windows representing the 12 tribes of Israel.
Out of the light of the Jerusalem sky and colored glass, he created a shrine to the 12 tribes of Israel, as he says, as effortlessly as birds sing. This despite the Orthodox restriction on showing a human face. These are Chagall's 12 tribes based on the poetry of the Bible and his mind. Reuben, thou art my firstborn, my might, and the beginning of my strength. Simeon and Levi are brethren. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. Judah, thou art he whom thy brethren shall praise. Judah is a lion's whelp. Zebulun shall dwell at the haven of the sea. Issachar is a strong ass crouching down between burdens. Dan shall judge his people as one of the tribes of Israel. Dan shall be a serpent by the way, an adder in the path. Gad, a troop shall overcome him, and he shall overcome at the last. Out of Asher his bread shall be fat, and he shall yield royal dainties. Naphtali is a hind let loose. He giveth goodly words. Joseph is a fruitful bough. Benjamin shall raven as a wolf. These are Chagall's 12 stained glass tribes of Israel.
Picasso once said that when Chagall dies, there will be no one left who really understands colour. And that's really what we see in these lithographic studies here. The colour of Chagall's work it's irrepressible. It's filled with warmth and joy and a sort of a heightened experience of the world around him. When he first came to Paris in 1910, nobody really painted like Chagall. And really nobody has painted like him since. It's a way of introducing symbols, figures, colours to the canvas, which is totally naive, totally childlike, abandoned to the joy of making art. And I think it's that sense of joy, that sense of freedom in his work, a freedom that he had not always experienced, that he'd had to struggle against in those early years in Russia, and then in his discrimination from members of the French press in his later years. It's a freedom that was so important to him, and it's a freedom which really runs through all of his work. I hope you've enjoyed today's broadcast, seeing those lovely Phil Rogers pots, but also these beautiful prints by Marc Chagall. Chagall's life is a life of such breadth and depth that we couldn't really possibly cover it all here, but I hope you've enjoyed seeing the works in print that we've shown you. There are many, many more on our website. I highly encourage you to take the time and go and explore those, and you'll get a real feel for the colour and the warmth throughout the works that he produced in his life. On Sunday, we'll also be showing a walkthrough, a live walkthrough of the exhibition upstairs. You'll get to see some of those beautiful pots in detail. It's been really exciting to see them coming in and already reaching new homes, so I look forward to showing you those on Sunday. And don't forget, on Monday, the Reverend Richard Coles is going to be talking to Phil Rogers live on Goldmark TV. They're going to be discussing the new pots in his exhibition. the philosophy behind his work, his working practice. That looks to be really exciting, so don't miss that. That's at 4 p.m. on Monday. I look forward to seeing you then.
We need to educate, entertain our customers.
Okay, so now we're going to look at some other of his prints.
Thinking very seriously about stopping making pots.
There's nothing forced, and I think his jogs are really the epitome of that.
Hello, welcome to today's broadcast from the Goldmark Gallery.
One of my most regular places to visit up in this part of the world is the Goldmark Gallery.